A retired factory engineer in Novosibirsk spends his mornings wiping dust off a 20-year-old sedan. Its paint is faded, its corners are rusted, but its engine turns over every single time the thermometer drops below -25. 2 blocks away, in a modern glass-fronted dealership, a pristine crossover sits under halogen lights. It boasts 3 digital displays, ambient cabin lighting in 64 colors, and a panoramic roof designed to show off the stars. It looks like the future. Yet, when the engineer looks at it, he doesn't see progress. He sees a ticking clock. For the last few years, the narrative was simple. An entire nation had switched its automotive allegiance overnight. Western factories closed their doors. Asian giants turned off the supply chains, and a massive, resource-rich country was left with empty highways. Then, without a sound, the vacuum was filled. Hundreds of thousands of shiny, hyper-technological vehicles flooded across the border. It felt like an industrial miracle, a seamless transition where the consumer lost nothing and gained a smartphone on wheels. But miracles in global economics are usually just illusions waiting for the glare of reality to hit them. The illusion is now fracturing, and it is doing so with mathematical precision. To understand the scale of what is happening, one has to look past the glowing screens and examine the shipping manifests. During the initial wave, this specific northern market was the undisputed crown jewel for exporters. It was a gold rush where anyone with a vehicle to sell could find a buyer desperate enough to hand over their life savings. But by the third quarter of 2025, a quiet, devastating realignment had occurred. Shipments to this once favored destination collapsed by 58% compared to the previous year. A market that was treated as an infinite sink for production suddenly choked. The country was abruptly demoted to third place on the global export priority list, falling behind a Latin American manufacturing hub and a Middle Eastern trade corridor. This is not a minor market correction. This is the equivalent of a locomotive traveling at full speed suddenly slamming its brakes because the tracks ahead have simply ceased to exist. The passengers inside are still enjoying the air conditioning, but the conductor already knows the momentum is gone. How does an entire empire of commerce lose its footing in less than 24 months? The answer does not lie in a sudden shift in consumer taste. The consumer still needs to drive to work, still needs to transport groceries, still needs to survive the winter. The blow did not come from the streets. It came from the ledgers of state planners. The rules of the game were rewritten overnight, transforming affordable foreign technology into a luxury accessible only to the ultra-wealthy. A specific environmental and recycling levy, alongside import tariffs, was weaponized. In late 2024, this utilization fee skyrocketed by 70 to 85% for new vehicles. For older, larger displacement models, the increase surpassed 80%. To the average citizen, these percentages sound abstract, like white noise from a financial news broadcast. But on the dealership floor, that abstraction translates into a brutal reality. A sudden premium of over 1 million rubles tacked onto a single invoice. A vehicle that once required a manageable loan suddenly demands the financial sacrifice of a lifetime. The tax has become larger than the cost of the machine itself. It is a pie where the nutritious filling has been completely replaced by the heavy, dry dough of state regulation. The arithmetic of international trades is unyielding. When a business model relies on high volume and thin margins, even a minor tremor in taxation can cause the entire structure to collapse. By early 2025, the import duty itself jumped from 20 to 38%. For the independent entrepreneurs who built the initial supply bridges, the math stopped working. A merchant who previously pocketed a comfortable margin of several thousand yuan per vehicle suddenly found themselves looking at negative numbers. The risk of transit, the volatility of currency, and the sheer weight of upfront capital required to clear customs turned a lucrative trade into a financial trap. The flow did not just slow down, it froze. No. Across the territory, the physical infrastructure of this brief golden age began to vanish. In the first 3 months of 2025 alone, 274 major dealerships shut their doors permanently. Of those casualties, over 200 belonged exclusively to the new dominant foreign brands. 4 out of every 5 showrooms that went dark were selling the exact same dream of digital luxury. The aggressive expansion that resembled mushrooms sprouting after a heavy rain has ended, and as any experienced forager knows, some mushrooms are deeply toxic to the system that consumes them. Even the largest, state-backed conglomerates are quietly pulling back. selling off local distribution networks and minimizing their exposure to a market that has become far too volatile. They realize that entering an empty room when the previous occupants have fled is easy. Staying in that room when the landlord returns with a completely new lease agreement is an entirely different matter. This is key because the crisis is not happening in a vacuum. The macroeconomic environment has turned hostile. Inflation is eroding wages, the local currency fluctuates as wildly against global benchmarks, and the central banking authority has maintained borrowing costs at punitive levels. When an auto loan carries an annual interest rate approaching 30%, a vehicle ceases to be a tool for mobility. It becomes a secondary mortgage, a long-running domestic tragedy, where every monthly payment reminds the family of a mistake they will be paying off for the next decade. The consumer who initially judged these vehicles with their eyes is now forced to use a calculator, and the calculator has no room for sentimentality or ambient lighting. In a harsh climate, a vehicle is tested by reality, not by marketing brochures. It must endure sub-zero temperatures, cratered asphalt, and thousands of kilometers of isolation, where the nearest mechanic might only possess a hammer and a wrench. The initial romance was built on complex features, but the daily reality of ownership is built on resilience. And it is precisely here, where the tires meet the frozen earth, that the deeper structural flaws begin to surface. The digital components fail in the frost, the software glitches turn vehicles into expensive, immovable sculptures, and the supply chains for basic replacement components remain thousands of miles away. Spoken in a language the local repair shops cannot comprehend. A vehicle is purchased for today, but its true value is determined by what happens tomorrow. When a warning light appears on the dashboard and the promise of a warranty turns out to be nothing more than a whisper lost in a distant corporate bureaucracy. The old established brands spent decades building a tedious, unglamorous web of service centers and predictable resale values. The new arrivals attempted to skip this step entirely, believing that a bigger touchscreen could substitute for an established reputation. They took an accelerated exam without studying the curriculum, and the real test has just begun. But the pressure from the domestic government is only half the story. There is a far larger global trap closing around this industrial powerhouse, one that extends far beyond the northern borders. To understand why this digital fortress is beginning to crumble, one must realize that the sudden tightening of regulations in the north was never an isolated act of bureaucracy. It was a calculated move in a much larger game of industrial survival. Every nation, when faced with an economic visitor that grows too large, eventually remembers the word sovereignty. They do not write it in propaganda pamphlets. They write it directly into the tax codes. For decades, the local automotive sector relied on a single flagship brand to mobilize the population. A rugged, utilitarian vehicle born in the Soviet era that prioritized mechanical simplicity over comfort. When the Western Assembly line stopped, the state had no choice but to throw the gates wide open to foreign imports. But a guest who fills an empty seat is very different from a guest who begins to redecorate the living room and claim ownership of the house. The state realized that if it allowed its domestic manufacturing base to be entirely suffocated by cheap foreign tech, it would lose millions of industrial jobs, and more importantly, its strategic autonomy. The current tariffs are not a temporary hurdle. They are a permanent retaining wall built to ensure that the domestic producer retains its dominance. Regardless of how many digital features the competition offers, this defensive posture is a symptom of a much deeper systemic crisis that is unfolding on a global scale. A manufacturing superpower that flooded these highways is currently trapped in an industrial paradox of its own making. For the past decade, its economic engine has been running on a single intoxicating drug, overcapacity. Driven by massive state subsidies, cheap credit, and regional growth mandates, its factories have mutated into hyper-efficient behemoths capable of churning out tens of millions of vehicles every year. The scale of this production is staggering, but it hides a fatal flaw. The domestic population back home cannot absorb this endless mountain of steel and microchips. The local market there is saturated, real estate markets have cooled, and consumer confidence is brittle. When a factory cannot stop producing without triggering mass unemployment and corporate bankruptcy, it has only one option. It must export its surplus at any cost. It must find empty spaces on the global map and fill them before its own internal pressures cause the system to rupture. For a brief moment, the northern vacuum seemed like the perfect pressure valve. It was a market willing to pay a premium for anything that moved. But as that valve is forcefully shut by retaliatory tariffs, the industrial surplus has been forced to seek new outlets, rushing toward alternative destinations like water searching for a crack in a dam. This explains the sudden aggressive pivot to Latin America, where over 400,000 units were dumped in a matter of months, and to the transport hubs of the Middle East. Yet, as the volume increases, the exact same pattern is repeating itself. The global map is no longer an open playing field, it is becoming a network of barricades. The leading economic superpower across the Atlantic has already erected a literal wall of triple-digit tariffs to keep these vehicles out. The European Economic Bloc has launched sweeping anti-subsidy investigations, preparing its own legislative armor. And now, even the Latin American manufacturing hub, which briefly enjoyed the influx of cheap transport, has announced plans to raise import fees to 50% to protect its own factory workers. This is the true, ominous reality behind the glossy advertisements. The automotive giant is not expanding out of a position of absolute strength. It is fleeing an internal explosion of overproduction. It is a massive steam boiler where the pressure gauges are flashing red. The internal fire cannot be extinguished, and every single escape valve around the world is being systematically welded shut one by one. The corporate strategy has always been to capture market share through sheer speed and aggressive pricing, leaving the tedious logistics of spare parts, regional adaptation, and customer retention for a later date. But when the global walls go up, there is no later date. You are left with millions of complex, highly sensitive machines stranded in climates they were never truly tested to survive, supported by a dealer network that is vanishing faster than it arrived. The entire model assumes an endless sky and an open road, completely ignoring the fact that global trade is governed by geopolitical weather, and a storm is currently rolling in from every direction. The consumer, standing in the Siberian frost with a blank digital dashboard, is not just a victim of a poorly soldered circuit board. They are the final, microscopic point of impact for a macroeconomic collision between state protectionism and industrial overproduction. They are realizing, through empty wallets and canceled trips, that the culture of service cannot be engineered overnight by a software update. The old legacy automakers, for all their faults and historical arrogance, understood that an automobile is a contract that lasts a decade. It requires a physical footprint of warehouses, specialized mechanics, predictable depreciation curves, and generational trust. The new wave treated the vehicle like a consumer smartphone, something to be used for 2 seasons, discarded, and replaced with the next iteration. But a population facing 30% interest rates cannot participate in a disposable economy. They require permanence. They require a machine that can be fixed with a basic toolset, not a device that demands a software decryption key from a server located 7,000 miles away in Shenzhen. As the financial pressure intensifies and the initial excitement evaporates, the market is entering a cynical, calculating phase. The romantic illusion of an effortless digital upgrade has died, replaced by a cold evaluation of survival metrics. Dealerships that were hurriedly converted from selling German luxury to housing obscure foreign brands are quietly calculating their exit strategies, realizing that the margins can no longer sustain the flashing neon signs. The remaining buyers are retreating into survival mode, either clinging to their aging, reliable Asian sedans like family heirlooms, or defaulting back to the crude, low-tech domestic options that at least promise available body panels at the local auto parts store. The grand experiment of replacing a century of automotive culture with a sudden blitz of screens has met its match in the unyielding reality of regional economics and sovereign pride. Yet, just as the narrative seems to settle into a predictable story of trade wars and defensive tariffs, a far more unsettling anomaly is beginning to surface within the data. A hidden factor that suggests both the regulators and the foreign corporate executives have completely miscalculated what the local consumer is actually doing with their money. Here is the thing that the analysts missing the forest for the trees have completely overlooked. We have been taught to view this entire drama as a story of a market shutting down, of a consumer backed into a corner by punitive taxes and exorbitant interest rates. It looks like a retreat. It looks like a slow-motion defeat for the foreign newcomers. But what if this sudden, violent braking mechanism is actually proof of a much deeper, far more cynical transformation? What if the state's aggressive intervention wasn't designed to keep these vehicles out, but rather to force a permanent, irreversible marriage. Look closely at the behavior of the most resilient corporate players. While smaller brands packed up their showrooms and vanished, the heavyweights did something unexpected. They didn't retreat across the border. They began quietly negotiating the sell-off of their local distribution networks to domestic holding companies. They started looking for ways to blend into the scenery. This is not the behavior of an invading army being pushed back. This is the behavior of an entity shedding its skin to survive in a new ecosystem. To understand this paradox, we have to ask a fundamental question. Who actually benefits when a fully imported vehicle becomes a luxury that no ordinary citizen can afford? The superficial answer is the domestic state producer, shielding its low-tech, affordable sedans from superior competition. But the real answer is far more calculating. By raising the financial wall so high that importing a finished car becomes economic suicide, the state has effectively issued an ultimatum to the foreign manufacturing giants. If you want access to our population, you can no longer just ship your surplus from factories in Shenzhen or Shanghai. You must build them here. You must bring your technology, your assembly lines, your stamping presses, and your engineering secrets into our territory under our supervision. The crisis, then, is not an ending. It is a forced localization campaign disguised as a trade war, and it is a trap designed to capture the foreign supply chain entirely, turning an aggressive exporter into a captive domestic tenant. Think of it like a wild river that a village decides to dam. At first, the water rushes in, flooding the valley and threatening to wash away the old infrastructure. The village doesn't try to block the water with their bare hands. Instead, they build a massive concrete sluice gate. They restrict the flow until the river is forced to divert into their own turbines, turning its raw chaotic energy into localized power that the village controls. The 70% hike in the utilization fee and the 38% import tariff are not meant to destroy the automotive influx. They are the concrete walls of that sluice gate. The state is testing the foreign corporate titans to see who is desperate enough to give up their intellectual sovereignty for a piece of the market. And for a superpower currently choking on its own industrial overcapacity, the desperation is real enough to make them comply. But what does this mean for the person standing on the asphalt? The consumer caught in the middle of this macroeconomic chess game? It means they are living through a massive, forced generational experiment. The narrative promised that if they just waited long enough, the old Western or Asian legacy brands would return, that this entire era was just a temporary, uncomfortable pause before the world reset to its familiar settings. People held on to their 20-year-old Japanese sedans like holy relics, convinced that the status quo would eventually restore itself. But the rising tariffs and the forced localization of the new tech have effectively burned those bridges. The old brands aren't coming back to the same market they left. They are returning to a landscape where the infrastructure has been completely re-engineered to support a different master. The consumer who refuses to buy the new localized crossovers isn't waiting for a triumphant return of the past. They are simply watching the past depreciate into junk in their own driveways. This leads us to a highly counterintuitive reality. The high interest rates and the sudden drop in dealership numbers look like a collapse, but they are actually purging the market of speculators and low-quality opportunists. The dozens of obscure brands that sounded like random digital passwords are being starved out, leaving behind only the massive state-backed entities capable of surviving the transition. The market is becoming leaner, harder, and infinitely more disciplined. The consumer is no longer being seduced by a cheap novelty. They are being forced into a long-term, high-stakes relationship with a select few heavily regulated corporate entities. The flashing screens and ambient lighting were the bait. The localized factories and domestic tax dependencies are the hook. The era of the cheap, imported digital toy is dead, but the era of the permanent, locally manufactured foreign ecosystem is being born in its place. Funded entirely by the premium extracted from the citizen's pocket, this brings us back to the microscale, to the individual human consequence of a system shifting its gears. In an industrial suburb outside Nizhny Novgorod, a middle-aged logistics manager sits in the kitchen, staring at a printout of a loan agreement for a newly assembled crossover. The interest rate is a staggering 29%. If he signs, he will be paying for this machine long after its digital displays have grown obsolete, long after the warranty has expired, and long after the geopolitical landscape has shifted again. His old car is failing, The winter is relentless, and the state has made sure that any alternative choice is financially impossible. He isn't thinking about industrial overcapacity in Asia, nor is he calculating the strategic autonomy of the domestic automotive sector. He is simply realizing that the vehicle outside his window is no longer a symbol of freedom or personal choice. It is a tax collection device on four wheels, a physical manifestation of a macroeconomic compromise that he never voted for but is entirely responsible for financing. Will this forced industrial marriage create a self-sustaining technological powerhouse? Or has the state simply locked its citizens into a permanent dependence on a captive partner that cannot survive without a constant infusion of regulatory protection? The financial ledger is finally balanced, but the human cost remains open-ended. What began as a dramatic narrative of market conquest and sudden retreat has revealed its true, rigid architecture. We are not witnessing the simple failure of an imported product line, nor are we watching a temporary economic anomaly caused by passing geopolitical tension. We are watching the closing of a trap. The era of easy choices, where a consumer could freely navigate between the mechanical reliability of the West and the affordable digital allure of the East, is gone. It has been replaced by a highly regulated, highly deliberate ecosystem where every choice is pre-calculated by state planners and industrial giants. The glittering showrooms that once promised a seamless, hyper-connected future were never the destination. They were merely the entry point into a new kind of economic dependency. The massive tariffs, the staggering interest rates, and the vanishing dealerships were not signs of a system breaking down. They were the sounds of the iron doors locking into place. When we zoom out from the immediate noise of the market, the broader implications stretch far beyond the borders of any single nation. This is the blueprint for the next phase of global commerce. As the world fragments into competing industrial fortresses, the consumer ceases to be a customer to be courted with quality and service. Instead, the consumer becomes a captive resource, a territory to be defended by one state and exploited by another. The foreign manufacturing superpower, suffocating under the weight of its own immense overproduction, will continue to press against the walls of the global market, seeking any vulnerability, any empty room to occupy. In response, states everywhere will continue to weaponize their tax codes, sacrificing the immediate purchasing power of their citizens to build walls of industrial sovereignty. The individual is left holding the bill for a global chess match, trapped inside a vehicle that costs twice what it should, running on software managed by a distant entity, and driving down roads where the past has been systematically erased. This brings us back to that quiet morning in Novosibirsk, where the retired factory engineer stands over his 20-year-old sedan. For years, his neighbors viewed his dedication to that fading low-tech machine as a stubborn relic of a bygone age. They looked at his manual windows and his lack of digital displays and saw a man left behind by progress. But as the frost sets in and the realities of this new era harden, the engineer's quiet ritual no longer looks like nostalgia. It looks like foresight. He understood instinctively what the market is only now learning through mathematical punishment, that true reliability cannot be simulated by a screen, and that independence is something you maintain under the hood, not something you download via a cellular update. His neighbors, who traded their predictable old vehicles for the shiny promise of the new digital wave, now look out their windows at machines that represent an escalating debt, a logistical labyrinth, and a permanent tie to a system that views them only as a metric. The lesson here is profound, and it is one that extends far beyond the automotive industry. It is a warning about the illusion of rapid technological replacement. When a society discards decades of established culture, infrastructure, and generational trust in exchange for a sudden, cheap influx of novelty, it rarely gains freedom. More often than not, it simply trades an old familiar master for a new, invisible one. The romantic phase of this industrial marriage is over. The flowers have wilted, the candy has been consumed, and the cold reality of everyday survival has taken its place. The question is no longer whether these new vehicles can successfully conquer a market. The question is whether the population can afford to sustain them as they mutate from an imported luxury into a permanent, localized dependency. Ultimately, we are left not with a need for sudden action, but with a profound necessity for awareness. We must look at the consumer goods that fill our lives not as isolated triumphs of engineering, but as the physical manifestations of massive, slow-moving geopolitical currents. When you sit behind the wheel of a modern machine and the digital dashboard boots up, displaying its vibrant colors and endless menus, you are not just looking at an interface. You are looking at a contract. You are looking at the heavy hand of state protectionism, the desperate pressure of distant factories, and the quiet erasure of personal choice. The next time you see a commercial boasting of a seamless, effortless transition into a high-tech tomorrow, look closely at the fine print hidden beneath the gloss. Because in the modern global economy, there is no such thing as an empty room. There is only a space you haven't yet been asked to pay for, and a landlord who is already counting the cost of your stay.